Hey, it's Emily Talerman here, and today we're going to be talking about types of resolutions. So in parliamentary debate, when you debate, you will be debating a resolution, a sentence. Some people tend to think that you debate a topic, but you're actually given a specific sentence for every round. And those sentences that you'll be debating can be broken down into three kinds: a policy, a value, and a fact. Now today I'll be explaining the differences between these three different types of resolutions. The first being that of a policy, which looks at whether or not the AF's policy should be implemented for the resolution's course of action. Now let's look at this example resolution here to learn more. The state of California should increase its number of carpool lanes. Say you're given that resolution and you're the affirmation. You're going to be arguing in favor of two things. Number one, California increasing its number of carpool lanes, and you're going to be arguing in favor of the policy you create in order to make that happen. Now I'll be going over in a separate video the proper components you need to make a policy, but in simple terms, a policy is your plan for making the resolution's course of action happen. In this case, that course of action would be increasing the number of carpool lanes. That's what's happening in this resolution, the what's occurring, the course of action, whatever you want to call it. Your policy is designed to make it happen. So for your affirmation, you're going to be arguing in favor of the state of California increasing the number of carpool lanes, and you're going to create a policy and use that to make it happen. And you're going to be arguing to convince the judge that California should increase its number of carpool lanes, and it should use your policy to do it. Say you get negation on a policy resolution. I go over in a separate video your options when negating a policy resolution, but I'll review them right now. You can either, number one, come up with a new policy and a new course of action. So say you don't want California to increase the number of carpool lanes, you can say that California, or really any government, for example, could ban plastic straws. That would be a new course of action, and you could come up with your own policy to make that happen. Or you can do a new policy, but still have this same course of action. So you would still have the increase in number of carpool lanes occurring, but you say you changed your policy slightly from the affirmations. Or you can not do any kind of counter policy, and you can simply use your contentions to argue why the AF's policy and the act of increasing the number of carpool lanes in California should not happen. So that's a very brief overview of how to negate policy resolution, which again, you can always check out that separate video and always ask if you have any questions about that. But in summary, a policy resolution looks at whether or not this course of action should be happening and whether or not the AF's policy to make that course of action happen should be used. Again, in the second example of a policy resolution, we have the U.S. federal government should legalize marijuana. If you are given affirmation for this, you come up with a policy that would allow the U.S. federal government to legalize marijuana. If you're the negation, you can go through any of those three options when negating that policy resolution. Now let's move on to value. Essentially, it weighs the value between two things. Which is more important? For example, the U.S. secondary education ought to value the arts over athletics. If you're given affirmation for this resolution, you're going to be arguing that the arts should be valued over athletics, that they are more valuable than athletics. If you're given the negation, you need to argue that athletics are more valuable than the arts. Now, sometimes people try to argue that instead of valuing one over the other, you should value them both equally, or value something else entirely, but I advise you to stick to the resolution and values as much as possible, because going in those two other directions often can be considered off focus or not directly negating your job. That happened to my partner Tacine and I once, where we were having to choose whether or not to value PE or life skills in schools, and we tried to argue that you could value both, but the judge didn't really respond well to that, and we lost that round because he thought that we didn't really do our job of negating the statement that one should be valued over the other. So because of that, I encourage you to stick to the idea of valuing one over the other. If you're affirmation, you're going to value what the resolution says to value, and if you're negation, it's going to be the opposite. In this additional example, we have the elderly ought to be prioritized over those with occupational risk for the COVID-19 vaccine. If you're affirmation, you're going to be arguing that the elderly need to be prioritized for getting the COVID-19 vaccine over those with occupational risks. And if you're negation, you're going to be arguing that those with occupational risks should be prioritized over the elderly when it comes time to get that COVID-19 vaccine. That's actually a resolution my partner Tessine and I just encountered at state quals. Now, in summary, we have policy and value. Policy, whether or not to do the course of action that the resolution states, and the AF's policy, and value, which between two things is more important, and how can you demonstrate their value, essentially. That's what your contentions would be doing in a value, is demonstrating the value of either. And that takes us to a fact, essentially proving whether or not something is true or false. Pretty simple. Now you might ask, well, how can you debate a fact? Well, if you keep up with politics these days, people debate facts all the time. And so you have to get used to the idea that you're going to be seeing fact resolutions. Even though instinctually you might think, well, can't you just Google whether or not something is true? Well, most of the resolutions you're going to get that are facts are kind of going to exist in the gray area, to where it might seem obvious to you one way or the other. There are going to be people where it's not so obvious, or they might disagree with you. So knowing how to debate a fact is very important as a life skill, not just as a debate skill. So debating a fact, it breaks down to pretty simple, whether or not something is true. For example, the use of nuclear weapons is immoral. Now, you could say that's either true or it's false. If you're affirmation, you're going to say it is immoral and it's true. Or if you're negation, you're going to say it's not immoral and that statement is false. Or this other example, the USFG is hiding information on extraterrestrials. You can either argue, if you're the affirmation, that it's true, or if you are the negation, you can argue that it's false. Now, just as a little summary, I put in green notes just little basic summaries of each as you start to learn and remember the different types of resolutions. So just to summarize, policy, you're looking at the AF's policy and the course of action. Value, you're prioritizing one thing over another. And fact, you're just looking at if something is true or false, or if the resolution is true or false. That being said, all of this, again, will become really natural to you as you get used to parliamentary debate. I know when I write things out, they seem like a lot of information because it takes up most of this whiteboard here. But I promise you, you will intrinsically know it sooner than you think. So if you have any questions, you can always ask me or an experienced debater. And that being said, I look forward to seeing you on the debate field.